Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our online talk today, a walk through time in St James's Park. My name is Laura McMahon. I'm the Community Learning Officer for the Royal Parks in London. And if for those who don't know, the Royal Parks is a charity. We support the 8 Royal Parks in London. They're Greenwich over in East London. In the centre, we obviously have St James's Park and Green Park, Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens, Regent's Park. And over in the west, we have Richmond Park and Bushy Park. We also look after some other green spaces like Victoria Tower Gardens and Brompton Cemetery. So if you can at all, and if you haven't already, we would really appreciate your donations. If you have possible, my colleague will pop a donation link into our chat. And this helps to keep our spaces open and free to everybody. Like most charities, we have had impacts on our finances, and we're also seeing an increase in users coming in to enjoy these beautiful spaces. So a bit of housekeeping before I start my presentation. This will be an hour roughly. There's going to be about 40 minutes for my presentation, and then we've got time at the end for some questions and answers. So you will notice your microphones are turned off, your cameras are turned off. This is because we've got over 100 people joining us this evening, so we're not able to have everybody inputting. But if you do have any questions you'd like answered, please put them in the Q&A function, which should be up in the top right hand corner for you, and I'll read them at the end, and I'll respond to as many as I can. For those who need it, we also have a captions function. You can go into the captions setting there and turn that on so you can see the text coming up as I speak. And I'll try and keep it as slow as possible. I do tend to speak quite quickly. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to start our presentation. So though St James's Park is actually our smallest of royal parks, it's actually only 58 acres. And if you compare that to Richmond Park over in West London, which is 2,500 acres, it seems pretty minute. But what it lacks in size, it makes up for in history. And if we look here at this map of St James's Park, you can see why it is so important to British history. Over here on the left, we have Buckingham Palace. Down here we have Birdcage Walk, and that would lead you to Westminster Abbey and Westminster Palace. Here we have Whitehall, and you have 10 Downing Street kind of tucked in there. You have Trafalgar Square just over here, and you have Piccadilly, Pall Mall, and then obviously St James's Palace, where St James's Park gets its name from. So over the 500 years that St James's Park has existed, lots of things have happened. It's seen a monarch lose its head. We've seen the celebrations of the end of the Napoleonic War go slightly awry. We've seen assassination attempts. We've seen the lake drained and used for the World War I effort. It's housed exotic animals like elephants and crocodiles. And in recent years, it's obviously used for a lot of ceremonies with the royal family, so royal weddings, trooping of the colours, etc. So join me as we're going to go through a walk in time where we will look at the history of St James's Park. So normally in pre-COVID time, if we can remember what that was like, I would normally deliver this as a walking tour through St James's Park. And I would normally meet you all here. So we would meet in the Blue Bridge, which is in the middle of the park. And the reason I do that is because it's situated right bang in the middle of the park and has the most beautiful views. Now, I would normally start off my walk by having a caveat to say I am not a historian, so you may have some stories that you have of St James's Park, and please feel free to share them in the Q&A. I love hearing more stories. But I'm not a historian. My background is actually in fine art and outdoor education, but I really love history. And you may tell from my accent, I am not British, I'm Irish. So I never grew up with British history. And from getting to work in the park for the last 4 years, I've been gathering all of these stories and I find it so fascinating. So these are my favorite stories of St James's Park that I will be telling you about through this presentation. So anyway, why do we do it at Blue Bridge? So we start the talk at Blue Bridge because over to the left, you would have Buckingham Palace, the beautiful Buckingham Palace, which we'll talk about briefly later on. And over to the right, you have Whitehall. Now, Whitehall is used as government buildings. It has 10 Downing Street just over there. And it's also used, the front of it, Horse Guard Parade, is used for ceremonial events like this here, which is the trooping of the colour. And this happens every year on the Queen's birthday, where she inspects her troops. And in this window here, the royal family will actually gather and watch her as she inspects her troops. But we're going back in time, so I want us to imagine what Whitehall was like 500 years ago, and it is quite different to what it looks like today. Whitehall was actually, at the time, 500 years ago, was actually the largest palace in Europe. It actually was even larger than the Vatican, and it had 1,500 rooms in it. And it was eventually the expanding Palace of Versailles took over the mantle of largest palace in Europe, but it remained a very large palace. Around 500 years ago, Henry VIII was in power, and he actually took over Whitehall Palace as the space for the royal court, because the royal apartments in Westminster Palace had actually recently burnt down. Now, what that meant was that obviously the Whitehall Palace was turned into a beautiful space fit for a king, but unfortunately it also served the same fate. Maybe Henry VIII was a bit unlucky when it came to palaces, because in 1698 a fire actually destroyed most of Whitehall Palace and most of the residential and government buildings. And it was started inadvertently by a servant who was supposedly drying some clothes on a coal brazier. It caught fire and it spread quickly through the palace, and it supposedly took up to 15 hours for firefighters to actually quell the fire. But at that stage, the Whitehall Palace was pretty much destroyed, and all that remained was the Banqueting Hall. So if we go back to this slide here, you can see the banqueting house, and this is the inside of it. Hopefully in the future you can go and visit. So that's Whitehall, but let's start thinking about what was happening with St. James's Palace and St. James's Park as well. So to get us thinking about how St. James's Palace and the park got set up, we need to go back 500 years, and we need to think about what London was like at that time. So here's a map of London today. You can see St. James's Park here. We've got Westminster, and then you've got all of central London with many busy streets, every space taken up with buildings and busy roads and only tiny bits of green space. But 500 years ago, London looked very different indeed. So this is a map of London from 500 years ago, approximately. Just to get your bearings as to what you're looking at, here is London Bridge. This is the City of London, and like most river cities, the city is revolved around the bridge, because if people have to pass the river, this is where they'll go by, so that's where commerce tends to happen. So most of London is based around London Bridge. There you can see the Tower of London, and all the way over here is Westminster Palace, and we've got Whitehall. Now, at the time, Henry VIII was in power, and he needed somewhere for his mistress, so we're going to look at that. So here's Henry VIII with his very famous mistress, Anne Boleyn. Now, at this time, Henry was still just about married to Queen Catherine of Aragon, but he had become smitten with his new mistress, Anne Boleyn. He wanted to build a palace that was close enough to Whitehall that he could go to court easily, but was far away from the prying eyes of the court, especially, I imagine, his wife's ladies' maids. So he sought his attention to a hospital that was to the west of Whitehall. Now, at the time, this hospital was called St. James's Hospital, and it held female lepers, so women who were suffering from leprosy, who were being looked after by nuns and monks. Now, as was Henry VIII's wont at the time, he unceremoniously chucked out the tenants, tore down the hospital, and built what he called a goodly manor, and this was St. James's Palace. Now, unfortunately for poor Anne Boleyn, she didn't get much of an opportunity to enjoy this palace that was built for her. In the 3 years it took for it finally to be completed, she was found guilty of treason. She was thrown into the tower and was ultimately beheaded. But this is what happened that gave shape to St. James's Park that we know today. So obviously you can't have a palace if you don't have gardens to go with it. So the marshland that surrounded St. James's Palace was enclosed, and that became the gardens for the palace. It was said that there was water gardens, fountains, jousting courts, and even an area that was kept for deer to be bred, to be shipped off to other parks, probably parks like Greenwich, where Henry VIII would be fond of hunting them. Now, this is what St. James's Park started off as the gardens for Henry VIII, but it took about 100 years further from that for us to start to see St. James's Park become the park we know today, and it all happened because of a civil war. So in 1642 to 1651, if anyone remembers their British history, Britain had a series of civil wars, and this was mainly over how the manner of England was being governed, religious freedoms, and generally Charles I wasn't really ruling in the way that the people enjoyed. So this war actually led to the capture of Charles I, and his son Charles II managed to escape to Europe. But for Charles I, he was actually he was sentenced to death and sentenced because of high treason. And he spent the remaining days of his life here in St. James's Palace. On the morning of the 30th of January 1649, Charles awoke on a cold morning and got dressed to face his execution. It was said it was so bitterly cold that he asked to wear a second shirt so that the audience who saw his execution wouldn't see him shiver and think it was cowardice. He was dressed in a black cloak and was walked by armed guards through St. James's Park to the Banqueting Hall, where there was a podium set up. Now, I'm sure Google Maps did not exist back then, but if ye olde Google Maps did exist, we would have known it would have taken him about 14 minutes to walk that walk to the Banqueting Hall. And I'm sure that time went very quickly for him indeed. When he got to the banqueting house, there was a big podium, and he stood on top and he spoke to a very large crowd with his final speech declaring his innocence. Now, unfortunately for him, the audience weren't able to hear him because they had been pushed back so much by the guards. When the executioner's axe swung that final deadly blow, it was said that the crowd emitted a large groan. Now you can see here, this is actually a shirt, the shirt that was worn by, or one of the two shirts, I guess, that was worn by Charles I at his execution. This was displayed only recently in the Museum of London. And you can see on it, it is quite stained. And they've tried to do DNA analysis to figure out what this was, and could it have been blood that happened when his head was chopped off, or did he possibly vomit at the sight of his executioner? We'll never know. But what we can take from this is that the execution of Charles I brought in Britain's basically becoming a republic for 11 years. And what that meant for the park, as well as a lot of Britain at the time, was that the park went into disarray. The trees were chopped down and used for firewood, and the lakes and ponds became noxious quagmires. And it wasn't until the return of Charles II did St. James's Park return to its former glory. So here we have Charles II enter the party king, as he was known. Charles had spent about 11 years exiled in Europe, which, you know, doesn't sound like he was having the worst time in the world. And he spent a lot of time in Italian and French royal courts. And when he came back, he brought back a lot of influences from Europe. And one of them was landscape design. So here is a landscape design of the gardens in Versailles, and you can see what the style was like at the time. You see these really straight columns and avenues of trees, very formal planting. And Charles brought that back with him and decided to redesign the palace gardens around St. James's Palace. So here you can see, and this is what St James's Palace looked like with the new design from Charles II. And you can see here, excuse me, beg my pardon. You can see here these long straight avenues of trees. Just to give you a bit of bearings as to where you are, this would have been Whitehall. This is St James's Palace itself. This is Birdcage Walk. And here, this long rectangle is actually a large canal of water. And if we compared that to what St James's Park looks like today, you can start to see how it's shaped what we know as St James's Park today. So here's St James's Park today. It no longer has that straight canal of water, but it's got a more naturalized lake, but you can still see Birdcage Walk. And most interestingly, you can see this long avenue, which we're going to talk about. So that was put in for a reason. For anyone who's been to London or knows London well, you will know this as being the Mall. So this is the Mall here, and this is literally the rolling out of the red carpet when you're going to Buckingham Palace. It's used a lot for pageantry. It's used a lot for like the trooping of the colours, royal weddings. People will be brought down the Mall. But its actual reason for existing is a bit of a funny one. It exists not originally to be this famous road that brings you to Buckingham Palace, because if we think about Charles II, Buckingham Palace didn't exist at this time. It actually all started because of a game of croquet. So as you can see by this reenactment that happened back in 2016, I believe, with some actors, they're playing a game of croquet called Pai Mai or Pall Mall. And this game needed a very long straight avenue to be played, and it was very popular and very much appreciated by Charles II. Now, it was said that the Mall, which we know from looking at the illustrations, if this is the Mall and this is St James's Palace, that it was very close to the edge of the compound of St James's Palace. And to the other side of the wall was a very busy highway that had lots and lots of carriages going up and down it every day. Now, it was said that there was lots of dust being kicked up by these carriages that were going over the wall and disrupting the game of croquet, disrupting the game of Pai Mai that Charles was so fond of. Now, being a monarch, they're not going to move the Mall away from the road, as we would assume is quite logical, but they decided instead that they would remove the road and bring it further away from the palace compound. So this was done, and he named it after his beautiful wife, Catherine, so it was Catherine Street, but we know it today as Pall Mall. So Pall Mall actually gets its name from peeved off locals who weren't very impressed about the fact that this road had been moved for a game of croquet that was called Pai Mai or Pall Mall. So next time you're in London and you're walking by, you can look at Pall Mall and say that came from a game of croquet. Okay, so for moving from one palace, so this is Pall Mall, which is just right outside St James's Palace entrance. I would normally bring you then to probably the most famous palace in all of the world, really, Buckingham Palace. So Buckingham Palace, it deserves its own talk, but I'm here really to talk about St James's Park, but I can't not talk a bit about Buckingham Palace. So Buckingham Palace actually gets its name from the Duke of Buckingham, who originally bought a house and did it up in 1698 and called it Buckingham House. It wasn't until 1761 that King George III and his wife Queen Charlotte moved in and renovated it to become a family home close to St James's Palace. It didn't actually become a palace until 1835 when Queen Victoria ascended the throne. And at that stage, it looked, though the staterooms were very grand and were gilded and beautiful colours, the rest of it was kind of in disarray. It was said it was very, very cold. The chimneys supposedly would smoke up, so they had to burn quite low, turning it into an ice palace. And it was said that the staff were pretty lazy at cleaning up. So it took quite a while for it to become the palace that we know today. And it looked quite different to what it does now. So here you can see this is what Buckingham Palace looked like just before Queen Victoria did it up. So with Queen Victoria's large family that she had moving into Buckingham House, along with her court, they needed to extend it quite a lot. So the facade that we know today that's in front of Buckingham Palace was added. And to make way for that, they had to get rid of this archway. And anyone who's from London or has been here before will probably recognize this archway, but it's not where you'd expect it to be, because this is actually the Marble Arch. So if you're ever in Hyde Park, in the northeast corner, you have Marble Arch, and that's where Marble Arch Station is. So that was actually removed and built back brick by brick, in front of Hyde Park corner. Sorry, up at the top of Hyde Park. So from the glittery world of Buckingham Palace, we're going to move back into the park, into the more darker history of the park. So I'm going to bring you to Rosamond's Pond, and I'm bringing you back in time to the 18th century. Now, in the 18th century, St James's Park was notorious for scandal. It was said that it was unofficially opened at night. So there was all of these thousands of unofficial keys that were given out to people, and it became quite busy in the nighttime, even though it was technically still not open to the public. It was haunted by prostitutes of both sexes. It was commonplace for duels at dawn to happen, and there was gangs of men who would go around assaulting and robbing and even murdering people. So not really a place you'd like to be. However, Rosamond's Pond, which doesn't exist today, just to give you a bit of context where you would be in the park, there's Whitehall, and that is Westminster Abbey in the background. Rosamond's Pond was a space where society women on the loose would go to find their clandestine lovers and meet up for whatever they were up to at night time. But it actually got a bit of a dark name because it soon became known as Suicide Pond. It was said that the young women who had maybe been gypped by their lovers had thrown themselves into the pond by despair. And if you think about what it was like to be a woman at that time, with not a lot of freedoms, I imagine losing a lover or possibly having your reputation destroyed would have been quite cataclysmic. So it had a very dark edge to it and was eventually filled in. So the park that we have here, so St James's Park had a poem written about it at this time by this gentleman here, John Wilmot. He wrote a poem called A Ramble in St James's Park, and he was a very famous poet who wrote scandalously inappropriate poems. And a film was actually made about John Wilmot where he was played by Johnny Depp in The Libertine. And there's a scene in it, if you ever want to find it, I think there's a clip of it on YouTube, where John Wilmot is walking through St James's Park and there's debauchery happening all around him. Now, for research purposes, I have read this poem, but it is so vulgar, I don't think I can get away with reading it out loud to you as part of this talk. However, I did manage to find at least one verse that wasn't quite so rude that gives you an idea of what it was like. And it goes like this. Great ladies, chambermaids and drudges, the rag picker and heiress trudges, carmen, divines, great lords and tailors, prentices, poets, pimps and jailers. Footmen fine fops do here arrive, and here promiscuously they swive. So that poem, read it at your own caution, but it does give a very good indication of what St James's Park was like. And it wasn't until maybe a few years later, when the park actually was opened up to the public, that we started to see it come back to its less scandalous self. So, at this stage of my walk, I would actually bring you all the way back to the other side of Blue Bridge. And the reason I'd bring you there is to talk about something that happened back in the 1800s. So if you were standing on this side of the lake in 1814, the bridge would have looked much different than it does today. It would have been this Chinese style bridge that had a large pagoda in the middle. And this was built along with quite a few other buildings actually were built in St James's Park, and Green Park, to celebrate the end of the Napoleonic War and Britain's success over the triumph of France. And there was a huge celebration night happening, and it was supposed to be that there would be fireworks coming out from the pagoda And as people waited for it to be alight, a gas lamp actually caught fire onto the pagoda and it set it ablaze. And the people watching supposedly thought that this was part of the celebration, but soon their claps turned to screams as they realized the building went on fire, and two people actually lost their lives trying to put it out. Though the pagoda itself was lost, the actual bridge stuck around for a few more years, until around the 1825, I think, yep, there's my notes. It was redesigned by an architect called Eric Bedford, and he designed it so that it was much more minimal and it was blue. And he said it had to stay pale blue so it didn't disrupt the view from the lake, and it has stayed so ever since. Okay, moving on from these kind of darker stories of the park, we're going to go to a bit more of the exotic side of the park, and we're going to look at Birdcage Walk and where it gets its name from. So Birdcage Walk gets its name from Charles I. He was an avid lover of exotic animals, and this can be seen even in the Tower of London, where there's these fantastic statues of lions and tigers and polar bears that were housed there. And just like in the Tower of London, there was also exotic animals housed in St. James's Park. Birdcage Walk gets its name because, unsurprisingly, there was bird cages that were hanging from the trees all along the pathway here, so that the members of the court could go and look at all of these exotic animals, their own personal zoo. This was expanded by Charles II when he came back, our party king, and it was said that not only was there exotic birds, but other exotic animals were in the park too. It was said that there was camels in the park, that in the Long Canal there was crocodiles, and there was even reputed to have a big elephant that had a diet of a bucket of red wine that was drunk every day. Now, I'm sure many of you would merrily appreciate a bucket of wine a day, but RSPCA, I'm sure, would have something to say about the treatment of that poor elephant. Though all our exotic animals are mainly gone, we do have some that remain, and I'm going to talk a bit about them towards the end, and they are our pelicans. So in 1684, a Russian ambassador gifted Charles II 5 great white pelicans. They are not native to our country, but since then we have had pelicans in St. James's Park, and we still have them today, but I'll talk a bit about them later on. Okay, so going on from our exotic animals, we're going to move on to a bit further in history. We're going to walk quite quickly to the 1900s, and we're going to look at World War I and what happened in St. James's Park at this time. So in 1914, a lot of air raids were really worrying the British public, and the government decided that the lake in St. James's Park needed to be drained. And the reason for that was the moonlight that was reflecting off the lake made it a really visible target. And you have Buckingham Palace right here, St. James's Palace and Whitehall. This isn't something you want to get bombed. So they drained the lake, and we did a lot of work only a few years ago in the centenary of World War I, and we were able to get all of this archival footage. So I've got a few images here, which is a mix of what the aerial footage was like at the time versus nowadays. So you can see some of this is modern and some of this is actually from the World War I era. So St. James's Park, because of its position right beside all the government buildings, was said to be needed to be commandeered to have buildings put in as part of the war effort. And one building was actually put in the lake itself. So this is a picture of, again, merging now and then. This is of Blue Bridge that we have seen before. And this is actually where the building was. And it was the Ministry of Shipping's building, ironically enough, put in a drained lake. People were pretty peeved at the time, though, that their beautiful park had been disrupted and taken over. And I have a quote from someone complaining in a local newspaper. And it says, "If you go over the bridge in St. James's Park, you will see to the right the Ministry of Shipping, and to the left a horrid, offensive eyesore, a sort of restaurant where waitresses appear to wait on themselves all day." This guy would have obviously been a fierce critic on TripAdvisor if he was around today, but it gives you an idea of how beloved St. James's Park was. So these buildings were put in, and obviously a lot of staff were brought in to man these buildings and to work as part of the war effort. And you can see here's another image of what the Ministry of Shipping building looked like. So this is what the lake looks like today, and this is what the lake looked like then. But a lot of office workers had to come in as part of this, and a few entrepreneurial people decided to set up some kiosks and restaurants to to sell their wares for lunch for these office workers that were newly in the park. And the reason I'm talking about that is because I want to talk about some entrepreneurial women that you might not have known about in St. James's Park, and they are the Milkmaids of St. James's Park. So since the time of James I, there has been cows in St. James's Park. We don't have them any longer, unfortunately, but since the time of James I, there was milkmaids who would bring their cows into St. James's Park twice a day. They would milk the cows live there, and they would sell mugs of milk fresh from the cow for a penny a mug. This was very, very popular, especially with the upper echelons of society, to come and see these cows and these milk maidens and selling their milk. And this went on for quite a while. So this is actually an illustration of what the milkmaid stalls looked like in the Victorian era. And actually, Charles Dickens Jr. wrote in a Dictionary of London in 1879 that there is a large consumption of curds and wheys and of milk fresh from the cow at these primitive restaurants. And the cows which are tethered to the stalls give an air of reality to the promise of their proprietors. So this long tradition of cows being in the park went on up until the early 1900s. And here, this is on the mall side of the park, and this is the kiosk of probably the most famous milkmaid of St. James's Park. This is of Elizabeth Kitchen, and this is taken in 1904. Elizabeth Kitchen had supposedly her whole family could trace their lineage back to James I, where the first milkmaids appeared. And it was said that the licenses for these milkmaids were passed down from women to women. And Elizabeth Kitchen said that she had inherited this from her family from the time of James I. Now, at the time, construction work was happening on the Mall, and she was one of the remaining kiosks, and it said that her kiosk was going to be demolished. And she wrote a letter to King Edward VII to say, you know, I have had this license since James I, you cannot get rid of me. And he actually gave permission for her kiosk to be moved to the Horse Guard parade side of the park. So there it actually is. Again, this is some of the research we've done. This is modern day Horse Guard parade. There's the parade there. There's the park just to the side, and this is the Mall. And this is where her kiosk was moved to. And it was called the Tin Cow. And when she passed away, it was passed on to her sister, Mrs. Oxford. And it stayed there until 1922. And even though a petition happened at the time, her stall, unfortunately, was moved on to make way for the new Guards Memorial that sits there today. But just a very interesting history, I think, that a lot of people don't know about the park. Unfortunately, today, if you were to go into St. James's, the only milk you'd be able to get would be a splash of it in your cup of tea. So across the way from Horse Guard Parade, you probably have seen before this beautiful building. And this is the birds keeper's cottage on Duck Island. And it looks like the gingerbread house from Hansel and Gretel. And I've often walked past it before I worked for the parks thinking it would be a quaint place to live. So Duck Island is an island on the Horse Guard Parade side of the park. And it was originally built as a way to trap the waterfowl for the kitchen pot, really. So there was these decoys put in, which were avenues built into the island where ducks would swim down and they would get caught and they'd be put in for supper for whatever reigning monarch there was. But Actually, at the time of Charles II, interestingly enough, he gave his, I assume his friend, the very prestigious title of the Governor of Duck Island, even though there was no inhabitants on the island except for some ducks. And supposedly one of the men who had this title of Governor of Duck Island was the man who created the champagne bottle. Interesting fact. Duck Island got got a big renovation in 1837 with the setup of the Ornithological Society of London. And they were set up to look after and research the birds that were in St. James's Park. And they actually fundraised for this building to be put in for them to have their meetings and also to become a home eventually for the bird keeper of St. James's Park. We still have a bird keeper of St. James's Park. He no longer lives there. And here's the picture of him here. This is Hugh. Hugh is our wildlife officer. We don't call him a bird keeper anymore. Part of Hugh's role is to look after and extend the habitats in our parks. He has to do a lot of emergency calls out to any animals that might have been injured in the park. But he's probably most famous for his role he has to do every day, and that is to feed our resident pelicans. So I told you earlier, we've had pelicans in the park since the 1600s, and we still have some today. Now, these are not, unfortunately, the descendants of those original pelicans gifted by the Russian ambassador to Charles II. And the reason for that is that pelicans are not native to this country, and they cannot breed in such a small number here either. So we're very lucky. We actually get gifted our pelicans, and we have done over the centuries. We currently have 6 pelicans who we have Isla, Tiffany and Gargi, and we have our 3 recent additions, Moon, Sun and Star. And 5 of those 6 have come from Prague Zoo, who's gifted them to us. And Prague Zoo are amazing. They do a fantastic breeding program, because pelicans are actually quite difficult to breed, because normally in the wilds they have to have massive flocks of birds to be able to have enough to make their flocks grow. They actually have basically pelican creches where 1 or 2 pelicans will look after the chicks while the others go out and hunt. So Prague Zoo have a very interesting method in which to trick the birds into breeding, and that is by placing mirrors all around their enclosure, making them think there is more of them than there actually is. So we have our pelicans that we have, except for 1, and that's Gargi. So you can see, I believe this is Gargi here in the middle. I might be wrong. These are the original 3 we've had for a long time, Gargi, Isla and Tiffany, in their outcrop on St. James's Park Lake. And Gargi is a fantastic story. Gargi came to us from a very unusual way. And it all happened because a man woke up one morning in Southend-on-Sea and looked out his window after a very stormy night and saw a very disgruntled and very ruffled pelican that was in its back garden. Now, we assume the pelican had been blown off course due to a storm and had landed in his garden. And this gentleman, after the pelican didn't seem to want to disappear, contacted ourselves and the zoo to ask for some advice as to how he would keep this pelican. But he soon found out pelicans are not good house pets, and he actually gifted the pelican to us. So we've named it Gargi, and it's been with us ever since. So unlike our other pelicans, who have had their tip wings pinned, which means they can't fly because they're non-native birds, and we have to make sure that they don't fly off. Because Gargi is a wild bird, she can fly, and she has been known to fly off on occasions. It's been said that Gargi has at times flown over to Regent's Park Zoo to get a second helping of fish stolen from the other pelican enclosure, and flown back in time to get hers from Hugh. But also during lockdown, Gargi managed to decide to fly away. When all of us were in lockdown, she managed to fly away to the coast, and she was sighted and people were reporting her to us, but she eventually came back. And I think that's a good indication of how well our pelicans are looked after in our parks, that she stays and remains even though she can fly off whenever she wants. So that that's how I like to finish off our tour. Normally, I would have you in the park and we would see the pelicans being fed. We do have a video actually up on our YouTube channel of the pelicans being fed that you can watch. And hopefully in normal times, as we go back to our normality, you can come and have a walk around the park and see our pelicans as well. So I'm going to say thank you very much. That is my presentation. And I'm going to open up for any questions that we may have. So let me get over here and see, have we got any questions in? Oh, okay. So someone has asked, is there any visible remains of the original canal throughout the park? And that's actually a really interesting question. There isn't of the original canal. So John Nash back in, I believe, the 1800s. I'm very sorry, my dates are terrible. So in the 1800s, that style of very formal landscape of straight canals kind of went out of fashion, and having a more natural approach was more acceptable. So John Nash, the landscape architect, redesigned St. James's Park to put in more natural edging. So even though the pond itself looks quite natural and lake-like, it's actually not. It's got a concrete base, and it had been drained in World War I. I think it was also drained possibly in World War II as well, for the same reasons as I said earlier. But it was recently drained back in 2012 because they have to clean the base of it quite often to make sure that we don't have a build-up of disease and dirt and things like that at the bottom, so to keep the water quality quite well. So it can get drained. They actually create a barrier so that all the fish and water aquatic animals stay in one space, and then the rest of it is open so they can dredge out the base. But I guess the fact that it's concrete and man-made is the visible remains that it is had from the original canal. Thank you for that. That was a great question. What's my favorite area of the park? God, do you know my favorite bit is over on Buckingham Palace side. So a lot of people tend not to go there, and whenever I deliver my walks, I usually start telling people about the dark history of the park in this area. So it's on the Buckingham Palace side, and it's really quiet there, and you've just got this amazing view. There's this like frame of willow, the water edge, where you can kind of see, actually like in where I am here in this presentation, but it's framed with willow and trees. You've got Blue Bridge, and then to the back you've got Whitehall, and then to the back of that you've got the London Eye, and it's very quiet and it's quite a nice area to be. Thank you for that. Oh, does the serpentine feed the lake? This is a brilliant question. We use, as part of our tour that we normally do, our walking tour, we actually get to sometimes go on to Duck Island, and in there we have our pump house. So the Victorians originally built a whole pump house that pumps the water. It was, I believe it was the other way around. So the water gets fed in from boreholes, but it actually the pumping system would pump the water from the lake in St. James's Park all the way up to the Serpentine and up to the Italian water gardens in Kensington Gardens. So it's going, again, the water was being pumped up a hill, which just shows the ingenuity of the Victorians. That pump house no longer exists, but you can still, it no longer serves a purpose. There's a whole different way of water being brought in now, but you can still see that pump house. So maybe in the future you might be able to come on one of our walks and see it for yourself. Where did Charles have the Mulberry Garden? Oh, this is great. So I didn't talk about the failed Mulberry attempt. So was it Charles? Apologies, I can't remember which monarch it was. I think you're right. It was probably Charles II, grew loads of mulberry trees because he wanted to challenge Asia. I think it was China was a big export of silk. So silkworms would grow on mulberry trees. So the larvae would eat the fruit, and then they would cocoon themselves in these cocoons made out of silk, and that's how you get silk. Is it's very bad. You boil the the larvae and you take out the cocoons. So he planted lots of mulberry trees so that we could get lots of silkworms and produce silk, and that could be a way of generating income. However, he actually planted the wrong type of mulberry bushes. So there is a mulberry bush actually if you are going from if you're going from Bluebridge to St James's Park Station. So if you're going towards Birdcage Walk, there's actually a really beautiful old mulberry tree that's kind of arched over. We have a tree guide of St James's Park on our website, and you can actually see there, and I think it tells you a bit about that. So there is some mulberry trees still in St James's Park, but I think a lot of them actually were in Buckingham Palace Gardens. Great question. Why is it named St James's Palace? So as it was built before James I. So the reason it wasn't actually named after King James, it was named after St James. So it's the St James Hospital that got torn down unceremoniously by Henry VIII, and that's why it kept the name St James's Palace. It was St James's Hospital. I've seen the pelicans fly, so you would have probably seen Gargi. Why don't they fly away? I'd like to think we're just looking after Gargi so well that it doesn't want to fly away. I mean, it has the perfect habitat, it's got its mates, and it gets fed once a day. So I think it just shows that they're happy. Yeah. How do you decide when you need new pelicans? Do you retire them at a certain age, or do you bring in youngsters every so often to keep the flock structure natural? Oh, great question. Just our pelicans, they last a very long time, but some of them do die, and then we generally want to keep the flock. I think at about 6 is kind of the minimum you kind of want pelicans to have. We had 3 for a while, but yeah, we like having around 6. I think it's to do with their flock animals. They like having other pelicans around. So that's why we keep them. We don't retire them. Just sometimes they do pass away. Let's see. Any swimming in the pond? I wouldn't want to swim. I wouldn't want to swim in the lake myself. You can still swim in the Serpentine Lake in Hyde Park, but no, you cannot swim in St James's Park Lake. It wouldn't be somewhere I would recommend to swim. Though the water quality is quite good. Where can we see artwork that you used to support this presentation? So if this is referring to the World War I work, if you go onto our website and search World War I, you can see all of the archival images that we have. We did a whole series, and we had how St James's Park, Kensington Gardens, Regent's Park in Greenwich, I believe, how they helped with the Great War. Could you share the lovely poem you read earlier? If you just Google a ramble in St James's Park, it'll come up for you. Yeah, read it at your own caution, by the way. Was it bombed in World War II? I don't know. Sorry, I don't know actually if it has. I mean, a lot of the parks were bombed. I know that Hyde Park, for example, lots of bombs went off. I think if you Google, there's a map. There's like a map of London that you can see where all of the bombs hit all of London. I know that. Yeah, I know from Hyde Park that happened a lot. La 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 la. My daughter remains traumatized by seeing a pelican catching and swallowing a live pigeon. Yeah, so pelicans are predators. They normally are pescatarians. They just eat fish, but they are predator animals, and sometimes they will eat smaller birds. And there has been times where a pelican is gone now. That there was a YouTube video of that one of the pelicans eating a pigeon. It's pretty traumatizing to watch. Brilliant. Let me see. Sorry about that. Great. There is a view of what looks like a fairy tale castle in the middle of a forest. Is this from the bridge? What is this building? I wonder if that is the birdcage, birdkeeper's cottage, perhaps. You might have seen it, and it's in on the actual Duck Island. Maybe is perhaps what we're talking about. Oh, here's another one. Thank you for the tour. Please tell us what happened to the pelican who lost her wing. It is a her. So I believe that is Isla who lost her wing, and it was a dog attack. A dog attacked her, but we were able to save her, but she did unfortunately lose her wing. So you'll see that if you see them flapping quite a bit, you'll see one of our pelicans has a wing missing. Just a really great note to actually, if you do have dogs, it's so important to keep them on leads, especially when they're around wildlife. But yeah, what happened to the Ministry of Shipping? Oh, I don't know, but I assume it was more needed for that there was more need for, there was more departments probably needed for the Ministry of Shipping. So though it probably existed in one of the main buildings, they needed to set up a temporary office for extra resources. Great. Are you planning on doing more of these events about the royal parks? Thanks, excellent event. Perfect timing for me to plug our upcoming events. So we are doing these online talks. We have started doing them. We're doing at least once a month, sometimes two. And our next one actually will be Protest and Power, where we look at women's history in Hyde Park. And that's going to be on the 11th of March. And it's all about celebrating women's history, because it's Women's History Month in March, and it's also International Women's Day on the 8th of March. So I'll be delivering that talk, and it's a fantastic talk. We look at pickpockets who were hung at Tyburn. We look at the suffragette movement and how Hyde Park was integral to that. We look at female duelists that got up and shot each other in Hyde Park. We look at how women were involved in the war effort in Hyde Park, and we look at how queens shaped the park that we know today. So if you're interested in that, you can sign up on our website for that. And we'll also be doing, this is our first of a series of online talks with the theme A Walk Through Time. So the next one will be all about Kensington Gardens. And I believe that's next month on the 25th of March. And we'll be looking at the history, so similar style to this, but we'll be looking at the history of Kensington Gardens. And there is so many amazing stories about Kensington Gardens. It's one of my favorite parks. So I think that might be all we have time for. Let me have a quick glance. Why are there so many Egyptian geese in St. James's Park where they gift to? Egyptian geese actually, I think originally would have been migratory birds. So they're birds that would have flown north for the summer and flown south for the winter. Am I getting that right? Am I getting confused? But because London is its own warm microclimate, they basically naturalized. So there is Egyptian geese everywhere in London. So they would have originally been migratory birds, and then they thought, I'll just stick here. The going's good. Yeah. Are there any turtles in the lake? Not that I'm aware of, but who knows what sometimes gets put in the lake. Interestingly, for the Kensington Gardens, for the Kensington Gardens walk, I'll be talking about the Round Pond, which is right in front of Kensington Palace, and that was actually built by, was it George I or George II? You'll find out if you come to the walk. But that was actually used to house turtles, which was again turtles were used to make turtle soup, which was very popular at the time. So there's not intentionally turtles in the lake, but who knows? Is the area around St. James's the only royal park that's lit by gas street lights? Actually, Hyde Park is still lit by gas street lights, and that originally happened from the first lit highway, which is Rotten Row to the south of Hyde Park. So come to the Hyde Park talk and you can learn all about that. Are there foxes? How do you protect the birds? Yes, like everywhere in London, there is foxes. Sometimes you will get fox attacks, and there's not much we can do about this. And I think this just goes back to the messaging of it's really important to try and not feed any of our wildlife, because more people that feed animals, the more pests that we get coming in, and then that really mess up the natural habitat and the natural ecosystem of our park. So that's one way that people can help actually look after the habitats of our parks is by not feeding our wildlife. Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening, guys. I'm sorry if I didn't get quite through to everybody. You will receive an email after this event. It'll probably be tomorrow, and you will have, from that, you'll get a link for our upcoming protest and power walk. You'll also get, if you haven't already, to how to sign up on our newsletter, and as well we'll have our donation button there too. So if you have enjoyed today and you would like to support all the work that we do in the Royal Parks to keep these spaces open and free to everybody, we'd really appreciate if you can donate. As well as that, you'll also get an evaluation form. We've just started, we're still only quite new with these online talks, and we'd love to figure out how we can do more. So if you would like, please fill in that form. It's very short, and that will really help us evolve our programme further. But that is it from me. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and hope to see you all again very soon. Thanks very much. Good night.